Look, sweetheart, I don't know what they told you over at sick call, but this is not a therapy session. That dog does not take visitors. He does not take treats. He does not take commands from handlers who've been working military working dogs for 20 years. So whatever you think you're doing standing at that fence every morning, I need you to stop. You are not helping him. You are not helping me. And if he comes through that gate and puts you on the ground, I am the one who fills out the paperwork. Are we clear? The kennel master, Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Briggs, was not a cruel man. He was a precise man, a man who had spent 19 years managing military working dog operations across 3 continents, who had written the incident reports when handlers got hurt, who understood exactly what a dog like the one in that run was capable of when the wrong person pushed too hard. He was a man of controlled, institutional caution, and the Navy corpsman standing at the chain-link fence, quiet in her utilities, hands loose at her sides, not backing up, not flinching, simply standing there in the pale, early light of a California morning, was not behaving in a controlled, institutional manner. She had not asked for permission. She had not introduced herself. She had not, as far as Briggs could tell, done anything at all, except show up every morning for 3 weeks running and stand at that fence and look at the dog. The dog's name, officially, was Franco. His designation in the Marine Corps Military Working Dog Program was MWD K459, a Belgian Malinois, 8 years old, 71 pounds of compact muscle and trained aggression, with 6 years of operational service that included 2 confirmed direct action deployments, 3 counter-narcotics surge operations, and 1 classified assignment that Briggs had never been given the full details of. Only the paperwork that said the dog had performed, and the handler had been medevaced. Franco was, on paper, a hero. On paper, he was also, increasingly, a problem. 3 certified handlers in 1 month. 2 of them had gone down. Not badly. Not the kind of thing that ended careers, but down, on the ground, with bite suits involved and voices raised, and the kennel log recording the interactions in the flat language of incident notation. The 3rd handler had simply walked back to Briggs's office, set his lead on the desk, and said, quietly, that he didn't think the dog was workable anymore. Briggs had agreed to consider it. The veterinary evaluation was scheduled for the following week, and then the corpsman had started appearing at the fence. Petty Officer 2nd Class Elena Vargas had been assigned to the base medical unit 11 days after transferring from a posting that Briggs had not paid particular attention to. Her record, as far as the kennel master was concerned, was not his business. She was medical. She was not, in any capacity he recognized, dog-related. She was slight, with dark hair pulled back under her cover, and she had a way of standing that was entirely still, the kind of stillness that wasn't absence of movement so much as absolute economy of it, as though she had learned some time ago that movement for its own sake was a form of noise, and noise was something she had no interest in. She had not responded to Briggs's instruction to step back. She had not argued with him. She had simply looked at him with eyes that were brown and level and entirely calm, and then looked back at the dog. Briggs had the strange and unsettling experience of feeling as though he had spoken into a room that understood exactly what he meant and had decided, politely, that he was wrong. Franco, in his run, had stopped pacing. That alone was unusual. He had been pacing since his last handler had stopped working him, a relentless, rhythmic circuit of the enclosure that the other kennel staff had learned to read as a warning sign, the physical expression of a mind with nowhere to go. He was pacing less when she was there. Briggs had noticed it on the 4th morning and told himself it was coincidence. He had noticed it on the 7th morning and told himself it was proximity conditioning, that the dog was simply adjusting to a new recurring stimulus. By the 14th morning, he had stopped telling himself anything and had started watching. She did not bring food. He had checked. She did not bring toys or a ball or a tug. She brought nothing. She stood at the fence with her hands at her sides, not gripping the chain link, not reaching through it, just present. And she looked at the dog, and the dog, day by day, had been looking back. Briggs was not a man who believed in magic. He believed in conditioning, in classical and operant mechanics, in the science of behavioral modification that he had studied for 2 decades. He did not believe that a dog with Franco's history, a dog that had been through what that animal had been through, responded to someone simply standing at a fence, out of sentiment or intuition or whatever the corpsman thought she was doing. And he walked out on the 22nd morning with the specific intention of sending her away before she could do something that resulted in him filling out the paperwork he had already mentally composed. He was, in fact, rehearsing the version of that conversation that was firm but legally defensible when he came around the corner of the kennel block and saw that the gate was open. He stopped. Franco was not pacing. Franco was sitting. He was sitting in the center of his run, and Petty Officer Vargas was kneeling 3 feet in front of him, not reaching for him, not commanding him, simply kneeling in the early morning light, with her weight settled back on her heels and her hands resting open on her thighs. And the dog was watching her with an expression that Briggs had not seen on that animal's face in months. He recognized it. In the language of working dogs, it was attention, not the vigilant, threat-scanning attention of an animal in arousal, not the flat, withdrawn attention of a dog that has stopped trusting the world, but the clean, alert, directed attention of a dog that has found someone it is willing to listen to. It was, in operational terms, the beginning of everything. Briggs became aware that he was holding his breath. He let it out. He took 3 steps back around the corner of the kennel block, leaned against the concrete wall, and waited. He was not, in that moment, thinking about regulations. He was thinking about what he was seeing, and what it meant, and how long it had been since that dog had looked at anyone like that. He came around the corner again 2 minutes later. Vargas was still kneeling. Franco had moved. Not far, 18 inches, maybe 2 feet, but he had moved, closing the distance on his own terms, and he was sitting again, closer now, and his head was slightly lowered, not in submission, not exactly, but in something that looked like recognition. Briggs walked to the gate of the run. He did not open it. He stood at the chain link and looked at the scene inside, with the careful attention of a man who is watching something he does not fully understand and is honest enough to know it. Vargas looked up at him. She did not look startled. She did not look as though she had been caught doing something wrong. She looked at him with the same level, settled calm she always had, and said quietly, so as not to change the quality of the air in the run, that she thought they should probably call the veterinary officer before the evaluation appointment. Not to cancel it, just to come and see this first. Briggs looked at the dog. Franco was watching him now, the attention shifting to track the new person at the perimeter, and in that shift, Briggs saw something he hadn't seen in the incident reports and the handler logs and the worried conversations with his staff. He saw a dog that was not broken. He saw a dog that had been waiting. He pulled out his phone and called Captain Reyes. If you believe that true strength is measured not in how loudly you announce yourself, but in how quietly you walk toward what others have turned away from, type competence in the comments below. This story is just getting started. Captain Diana Reyes, the base veterinary officer, had 14 years of military working dog medicine behind her. She had seen dogs recover from injuries that should have ended them. She had seen dogs fail out of programs that had invested years in their training. She had presided over the retirements of animals that had given everything the Corps had asked of them. and she had presided over the harder determinations, the ones that came when an animal's mind had gone somewhere the handlers couldn't follow, and the kindest thing was to release them from the weight of expectation. She had not, in 14 years, seen what she was looking at when she arrived at the kennel facility 20 minutes after Briggs called her. Franco was lying down, not the flat, guarded, head between the paws sprawl of a dog in stress. He was lying on his side, his legs extended, his breathing slow and even, and Vargas was sitting cross-legged on the ground of the run beside him, not touching him, not looking at him directly, simply present, and the dog's eyes were half closed. Reyes stood at the gate beside Briggs for a long moment without speaking. Briggs was very still. He had the quality, in that moment, of a man who has had a significant assumption corrected and is still working out the precise nature of the correction. "How long?" Reyes said, quietly. 22 days, Briggs said. "She's been at the fence every morning for 22 days. Reyes looked at him. "You knew?" "I told her to stop." He paused. "She didn't." Reyes looked back at the dog and the woman sitting beside him and did not say anything for a while. Then, "Who is she?" "Corpsman. Assigned to the medical unit 11 days after Franco's last handler signed off." Briggs's voice was careful, the voice of a man delivering information in sequence, because the sequence mattered. "I didn't pull her record. She's medical. She's not in my chain." Reyes nodded slowly. Then she opened the gate and stepped in. Vargas looked up. She did not move from her position on the ground. Franco's eyes opened fully at the sound of the gate, tracked to the new arrival, assessed, and partially closed again. Reyes noted this with the professional attention of someone who had spent 14 years reading dogs. "Can I ask you something?" Reyes said. "Yes, ma'am." "What are you doing?" The corpsman considered the question with what seemed like genuine attention, as though she wanted to answer it accurately rather than simply. "Reminding him," she said, "that not everything is a test." Reyes crouched at a respectful distance and looked at the dog. "How do you know he needed to hear that?" Vargas was quiet for a moment. The morning light was moving across the concrete, and the chain link, and the low-angled shadows of the kennel block, and the base around them was warming into its daily noise, the distant grind of vehicles, the mechanical voices of a training exercise 2 fields over, the ordinary sounds of an installation that did not know it was containing a small, precise mystery. "Because I knew him," Vargas said, "before." Reyes looked at her. Briggs, at the gate, went very still. "Before," Reyes repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Reyes stood. She looked at the dog again, at the way Franco was lying in the light of the California morning, with a stillness that 3 certified handlers in the last month had not been able to produce with any amount of technique or equipment. Then she looked at the corpsman. "I think," she said, "we need to go somewhere and talk." Vargas unfolded herself from the ground with a single, fluid motion. She looked at Franco. The dog watched her stand, and then he stood too, rising in that liquid, effortless way of his breed. And he fell in at her left side, not because she commanded it, not because she had a lead, but because that was where he had been trained, years ago, to be. Briggs made a sound. It was not quite a word. It was the sound of a man watching a dog that had put 2 handlers on the ground in the last month, walking in heel position beside a Navy corpsman he had never entered a personnel record about, and understanding that something had been wrong about every assumption he had made since Franco's last handler had set his lead on the desk and said the animal wasn't workable anymore. "Gunnery Sergeant," Reyes said, stepping out of the run, "please come with us." They walked across the compound in the morning light. Franco walked at Vargas's left side, 71 pounds of operational muscle and 8 years of trained memory, and he walked there as naturally as breathing, as though no time had passed, as though the distance between then and now was nothing at all, a brief interruption in a conversation that was simply resuming. The other kennel staff, arriving for the morning shift, stopped what they were doing and watched. Nobody said anything. There was nothing adequate to say. They went to Reyes's office, a small, functional room with a whiteboard and a filing cabinet and the particular smell of antiseptic and paperwork that military offices accumulate. Vargas sat across from the veterinary officer. Briggs stood at the door. Franco settled on the floor beside the corpsman's chair as though he had done it 1,000 times. Because he had. "Your name and unit before this posting," Reyes said. Petty Officer 2nd Class Elena Vargas, ma'am, originally assigned to 26 Dental Battalion, Fleet Marine Force, reclassified from MOS 8752 to 8404 14 months ago following program dissolution. She paused. My earlier record is filed under a different unit designation. Reyes already had her hands on the keyboard. What designation? 1st Marine Raider Battalion, Support Attachment. I was listed as a MWD training specialist under a joint training augmentation program that ran from 4 years ago through roughly 3 years and 2 months ago. Her voice was entirely level. The program was reorganized. My MOS was reclassified. My service record was restructured through the normal transition process. The room was quiet, except for the keyboard. Briggs said, "You're telling me you trained that dog." "I trained Franco from 18 months of age through his full operational certification," Vargas said. "I ran his initial obedience sequence, his aggression development, his bite work, his track and area search, and his basic patrol phases. I was his primary handler for the first 14 months of his operational preparation. I participated in his pre-deployment certification package." She looked at the dog beside her chair. "I was not deployed with him. My program was restructured before his first operational cycle." Briggs stared at her. He was a precise man who understood cause and effect and the mechanics of conditioning, and he was doing the math, and the math was landing in a way that made the incident reports and the handler logs and the scheduled evaluation feel, suddenly, like a complete misreading of the situation. "He didn't forget his training," Briggs said. It was not quite a question. "No," Vargas said. "He didn't. He stopped accepting handlers because they weren't you." She was quiet for a moment. "That's an oversimplification. He's a highly trained operational animal with 6 years of accumulated stress and a significant change in his working context. There are multiple factors." She paused. "But yes, I think some part of the difficulty was that." Reyes pulled up the service record. She read it for a long moment. Then she turned the screen so Briggs could see. He read it. His face changed. The record that came up under the Joint Training Augmentation Program cross-reference was not the record of a standard MWD training specialist. The certification strings alone took up a quarter of the screen. Completed courses in advanced patrol dog training, accelerant detection, specialized search, aggression management, behavioral modification, a dual certification in handler training and training program development. A commendation from the 1st Marine Raider Battalion's commanding officer citing exceptional performance in the development and execution of working dog training programs in direct support of Special Operations Forces. A note from the program director recommending her for retention in the program at the senior trainer level. Then the restructuring order, the MOS reclassification, the transfer. Briggs read it twice. Then he looked up at Vargas. "You were his trainer," he said. "His entire foundational training. You built him." "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant." "And then you got reclassified." "Yes." "And he got deployed." "Yes." "And 6 years later, he's in my kennel, putting certified handlers on the ground, and you're the new corpsman on base." Vargas met his eyes. "Yes." Briggs looked at the dog. Franco looked back at him with the clean, directed attention of an animal that had found its reference point and had no intention of losing it again. If stories like this matter to you, the ones about people who do the work quietly and let the record speak when the time comes, there's a Patreon link in the description below. That's where this channel lives. The veterinary officer, Captain Reyes, closed the record. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at Elena Vargas with the expression of someone who has just received a significant recalibration and is deciding what to do with it. "The evaluation is cancelled," she said. "Franco is not being retired." Briggs nodded once, slowly. "The question," Reyes continued, "is what we do now. She's medical. He's a working dog asset. This isn't a standard handler assignment." Vargas said, quietly, "I'm not asking for a handler assignment." "Then what are you asking for?" "I'm asking for authorization to work with him until he's ready for a new handler. Not to replace a handler, to bridge." She looked at Franco, who was watching her with the steady, patient attention of a dog that has learned to wait. "He needs to transfer his reference. That's a training process. I can run it. It's what I was trained to do." She paused. "And then he can go back to work." Reyes looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at Franco. There was a silence in the small office that had a particular quality to it. The quality of a conclusion that everyone present could feel, but nobody had put into words yet. "How long?" Briggs said. 6 to 8 weeks for a solid transfer to a new handler, assuming the right match," Vargas said. "Probably less. He's not broken. He never was." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need to make some calls." He made them. The first was to his commanding officer. The second was to the MWD program office. The third, because Reyes had pulled up enough of the cross-referenced record to understand the full shape of what they were dealing with, was to the Special Operations Forces liaison at the battalion level, who listened to a brief summary of the situation and said, with the flat directness of someone who dealt in operational realities, that if the dog was certifiable and the trainer was available, the paperwork for a temporary additional duty assignment could be processed within 48 hours. It was processed in 36. The base did not learn all of it at once. Bases rarely do. Information moved the way it always moves in military communities, in fragments, in the gaps between official communication, carried by the people who had been standing in the right place at the right time to see something they couldn't quite explain. The kennel staff knew first. They had watched Franco walk in heel position beside a Navy corpsman on the 22nd morning of her fence-standing vigil, and they had understood, in the way that people who work with animals every day develop an instinct for, that what they had seen was not a trick or a coincidence or a lucky morning. It was something older than that. It was recognition. The handlers knew next. 2 of them, the ones who had gone down in the run with Franco, heard about it from the kennel staff, and they had the particular reaction of people who had been genuinely frightened by something and are now learning that the thing that frightened them was not, in fact, random. There is a specific relief in understanding that a force has a source. It does not erase the bruises, but it changes what the bruises mean. The wider base community assembled the picture over weeks, the way communities do, from the authorized fragments and the unofficially circulated ones, from the body language of the kennel master when someone asked him about the new handler arrangement, from the way Captain Reyes spoke about the upcoming certification cycle with a carefully restrained satisfaction, from the sight of Elena Vargas walking the perimeter road in the early morning with Franco at her left side, both of them moving with the same quality of settled, purposeful quiet. Nobody knew the full record, The Joint Training Augmentation Program cross-reference was not a document that circulated in base gossip, but people understood the essential shape of it. A dog that 3 handlers couldn't manage had been reached, without commands or equipment or any apparent technique, by a corpsman who turned out to have built the dog from the beginning. The rest was detail. What they discussed was the fence. 22 mornings. No equipment, no treats, no commands. Just a woman standing at a chain-link fence, looking at a dog that the system had decided was done. It became, on that installation, a kind of shorthand. People who understood what had happened there used the phrase "standing at the fence" to mean something specific. The act of being present for something that has been written off, of showing up without an agenda, of waiting with the kind of patient certainty that does not require external validation. It was the phrase for doing the work before anyone is watching, for the intervention that looks like nothing from the outside and looks, from the inside, like everything. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs used it once, in a training brief for new kennel staff, 6 months after the morning he had rounded the corner and found the gate open and the dog sitting. He was talking about behavioral assessment, about the limits of standardized evaluation, about the difference between an animal that has failed and an animal that has been failed by the assessment. And he paused in the middle of the brief and said, without quite planning to, that the most important thing he had learned in 19 years was that the paperwork did not always know what was in the run. The new kennel staff looked at him. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. They all knew what he meant. It was already part of the vocabulary of the place. Elena Vargas completed her temporary additional duty assignment in 7 weeks, 3 days ahead of the conservative estimate she had given Reyes in the small office on the morning of the 22nd day. Franco was transferred to a new handler, a young sergeant named Castillo, who had scored in the top 5% of the most recent handler course and who had been selected specifically for the assignment based on Vargas's assessment of the behavioral profile she had spent 7 weeks documenting. The transfer was clean, the kind of clean that looks easy to anyone who doesn't know how much deliberate, invisible work went into making it so. She attended the transfer briefing. She watched Castillo run through the initial handling sequence with Franco, with the focused, clinical attention of someone evaluating a technical process, and she noted the small adjustments she had prepared him for, the particular way Franco signaled readiness versus compliance versus discomfort, the distinction between his working focus and his stress indicators, the 2 hand positions he had been conditioned to respond to that were not in the standard protocol. She had documented all of it. She handed the documentation to Castillo at the end of the briefing, a 70-page behavioral profile written in the precise, economical language of someone who had spent years learning how to make complex things legible. Castillo looked at it. Then he looked at her. "You wrote all of this in 7 weeks?" "Most of it I knew already," she said. "I was just writing it down." He was quiet for a moment. "He's a different dog than what I read in the incident reports." "He was always a different dog than what was in the incident reports," she said. "The incident reports were measuring the wrong thing." She returned to the medical unit the following Monday. She resumed her regular duties. She ran her morning route past the kennel facility, and she did not stop at the fence. She did not need to anymore. Franco was working. That had been the point. What she had not anticipated, and what she discovered over the following weeks, was that the installation had quietly decided she was something worth paying attention to. Not loudly, not in the way of official recognition, though that came later. In the way that military communities recognize things that matter, through the slow redistribution of credibility, through the way that Briggs made a point of speaking to her when they crossed paths and meant it in a way that was different from before, through the way that the handler community, small and insular and not particularly in the habit of extending regard to personnel outside their chain, began to nod when they saw her in a way that said something specific about what they thought she was. Captain Reyes submitted a commendation. Briggs co-signed it. The language was formal and spare, as military language tends to be, but the substance of it was plain. A military working dog asset, assessed as non-workable, had been restored to full operational status through the intervention of a personnel member who had identified the source of the behavioral disruption and addressed it through a methodology that demonstrated expertise beyond the scope of her current assignment, and who had then developed and executed a handler transition program that resulted in a certified operational team. The commendation cited her original training credentials and recommended her for consideration in any future MWD training program development role. The commendation was filed. These things are filed. But it was read by the people who read such things, and it moved through the channels that official recognition moves through. And 6 months later, Elena Vargas received orders to a joint special operations training support role that neither Briggs nor Reyes had specifically anticipated, and that Vargas, when she read the orders, accepted with the same unceremonious steadiness she brought to everything. She found out later that the recommendation had come from the Special Operations Forces liaison officer who had processed the temporary additional duty paperwork. He had read the veterinary officer's commendation and the behavioral profile and the handler transition documentation, and then he had made a call. He had described her, in the language of that call, as someone who understood dogs the way effective operators understand terrain, not as obstacles to be overcome, but as systems to be read, and whose reading of systems was precise enough to be genuinely useful in contexts where imprecision was expensive. She was, by any measure, the right person for the role. She had always been. The paperwork had simply taken longer than the dog to figure it out. Franco deployed with Sergeant Castillo, 8 months after the morning Vargas had opened the gate and knelt in the pale California light. The deployment was classified in the standard operational manner. What was not classified, what was simply fact, was the performance record that came back afterward. The log entries that described a dog handler team operating at the high end of the assessment scale. The mission support documentation that used the language available to it to describe something that the people in the field knew in plainer terms. The team worked. The dog was exceptional. The handler understood the dog. He had been built that way, 8 years ago, give or take, by someone who had understood, before she understood anything else about that animal, that the relationship between a working dog and the person responsible for its formation was not a transaction, but a language, and that languages, properly taught, were not forgotten. The kennel facility on the Marine Corps installation saw other dogs after Franco, other handlers, other assessments, other challenges, other mornings that required calibration and patience, and the willingness to look at what was actually in the run rather than what the incident report said was in the run. Briggs continued to run the facility with the same precision he had always brought to it, and he added one thing to his standard briefing for new personnel. One amendment to the orientation protocol he had been running for years. He told them about the fence, not the full story, not the classified portions, not the elements that were properly contained within the appropriate channels. He told them the shape of it. A dog that the assessment had decided was done, and a woman who had stood at the fence for 22 mornings without commands or equipment or any visible technique, and what had happened on the 22nd morning. He told it without commentary, without the kind of editorial weight that turns a story into a lesson. He simply told what had happened, and let the people listening draw their conclusions. He found, over time, that they drew the right ones. People usually do when they're given the accurate facts. The lesson, as the kennel staff passed it down through the years that followed, was not complicated. It was the kind of lesson that military communities have always known, and sometimes forget, and sometimes need to be reminded of by a dog sitting in the dust of a run in the early morning light. That the most dangerous assumption is the one that confuses noise with authority and silence with absence. That the person who has nothing to prove is generally the person who has already proven everything. That a record filed under a different unit designation is still a record. And that when a dog trusts someone completely, it is worth asking, carefully and without prejudice, exactly who that person is. They asked. On the 22nd morning, they finally asked. And the answer, when it came, was written in the way Franco walked at Elena Vargas's left side across a sunlit compound while the rest of the base stopped and watched and understood for the first time that they had been standing next to something extraordinary for 22 mornings and had not known it, because extraordinary things rarely announce themselves at the fence. They wait. They stand in the early light. They do not move away. And when the time comes, they open the gate, and they walk in, and the thing that was broken remembers that it never was. For more stories about the quiet professionals among us, the ones who carry their record in silence and let the work speak when the moment comes, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. This channel exists to honor them. And if you would like to help me keep telling these stories, you will find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.